I'm Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, and I was the chief financial officer at Henderson Industries for 8 years, before CEO David Henderson fired me to make room for his incompetent nephew Tyler. After dedicating nearly a decade to building the company's financial systems from the ground up, David told me my services were no longer needed, and that Tyler would bring fresh perspective to the CFO role. What David didn't know was that I had discovered a massive financial discrepancy during my final audit, $100 million in fraudulent transactions that led straight to offshore accounts controlled by the Henderson family. As I sat in my car after being escorted out like a criminal, I realized I held the evidence that could destroy everything David had built on lies and corruption. Sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who knows exactly where all the bodies are buried. Like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, because this story is about to get very interesting. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humiliation began the moment David Henderson's assistant knocked on my office door at 9:15 a.m. on what I thought would be another ordinary Tuesday. My company ID badge was still clipped to my navy blazer, the same badge that had granted me access to every floor, every meeting, every confidential financial document for 8 years. In less than an hour, that same badge would become a symbol of everything I was about to lose. "Sarah, Mr. Henderson needs to see you in his office immediately," Jennifer said, her voice carrying an unusual tension I couldn't quite place. As his longtime assistant, Jennifer had always been warm and professional with me. Today, she wouldn't meet my eyes. I grabbed my tablet and the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing, assuming David wanted to discuss the financial projections we'd been working on for the board meeting. I'd spent the previous evening fine-tuning the numbers, ensuring everything was perfect as always. My attention to detail had made Henderson Industries one of the most financially stable companies in our sector. David's corner office felt different that morning. He sat behind his mahogany desk with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, distant, almost hostile. Standing beside him was Marcus Webb, the head of corporate security, a man whose presence typically meant serious trouble. For someone, "Sarah, please sit down," David said without his usual warmth. No small talk about my weekend, no questions about the reports in my hands, just a formal directive that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. "I'll get straight to the point," he continued, sliding a white envelope across his desk toward me. "We're making some organizational changes, and we've decided to go in a different direction with the CFO position. Your employment with Henderson Industries is terminated, effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. 8 years. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, of building financial systems from outdated spreadsheets into sophisticated analytical tools. 8 years of increasing company profits by 340% through strategic financial planning. 8 years of loyalty, dedication, and what I thought was mutual respect. "I don't understand," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "David, we've worked together for nearly a decade. The company is performing better than ever. What organizational changes? We're bringing in fresh perspective," he replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over. "Tyler will be taking over your responsibilities next week." Tyler, his nephew, the 26-year-old with an MBA from a mediocre business school, and absolutely no real-world financial experience. The same Tyler who'd been hanging around the office for the past month, asking basic questions about financial concepts I'd mastered in my first year out of college. "David, you can't be serious. Tyler doesn't have the experience to—" "The decision is final, Sarah." His voice carried a finality that told me this wasn't a discussion. "Marcus will escort you to collect your personal items. Your final paycheck and benefits information are in the envelope." Marcus stepped forward, his presence making it clear that arguing would be futile and embarrassing. As I stood on shaking legs, my company ID badge caught the morning light streaming through David's windows. That small plastic rectangle had been my passport to a career I'd built from nothing. Now it felt like evidence of my naivety. The walk through the office was a blur of shocked faces and whispered conversations. My colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, collaborated on major projects, watched in stunned silence as security escorted me past their desks. Some looked sympathetic, others confused, but all maintained the careful distance that people keep when witnessing someone else's professional execution. In my office, I mechanically placed personal items into a cardboard box Marcus provided. Family photos, my favorite coffee mug, the small, succulent plant I'd somehow kept alive for 3 years. Everything that had made this space mine for nearly a decade fit into one pathetic box. As Marcus walked me to the elevator, my badge still clipped to my jacket like a cruel joke, I realized that David Henderson had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Sitting in my car in the Henderson Industries parking lot, I stared at the Employee of the Year plaque I'd just pulled from my cardboard box. The brass nameplate read, Sarah Mitchell, Outstanding Leadership in Financial Excellence, 2022. 2 years ago, David Henderson had personally presented this award to me at the company's annual dinner, praising my invaluable contributions to our continued success. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I'd started at Henderson Industries 8 years ago as a junior financial analyst, fresh out of graduate school with an MBA in finance, and a burning desire to prove myself in the corporate world. The company was smaller then, still family-owned but growing rapidly under David's leadership. He'd hired me personally after 3 rounds of interviews, telling me he saw exceptional potential in my analytical skills. Those early years were a whirlwind of learning, growth, and genuine satisfaction. I threw myself into every project, staying late to perfect financial models, volunteering for additional responsibilities, and slowly earning the respect of colleagues who initially saw me as just another ambitious graduate. David became something of a mentor, teaching me the nuances of corporate finance, while trusting me with increasingly complex projects. When the previous CFO retired in 2019, I wasn't surprised that David offered me the position. By then, I'd essentially been doing the job for 6 months, managing everything from quarterly reports to board presentations, while the CFO focused on his transition to retirement. "You've earned this, Sarah," David had said when he offered me the promotion. "I can't think of anyone better suited to guide our financial future." Under my leadership as CFO, Henderson Industries had experienced unprecedented growth. I'd restructured our debt obligations, saving the company millions in interest payments. I'd implemented new financial controls that eliminated waste and increased efficiency across all departments. I'd negotiated contracts with vendors that improved our profit margins by 18%. Most importantly, I'd modernized our financial systems, replacing outdated processes with sophisticated analytical tools that gave us real-time insights into company performance. The numbers didn't lie. When I became CFO, Henderson Industries was valued at approximately $200 million. Today, largely due to strategic financial planning and careful growth management, the company was worth nearly $900 million. I'd helped build something remarkable, transforming a modest family business into a major player in our industry. But my contributions went beyond just numbers. I'd hired and trained a finance team of 12 highly skilled professionals. I'd established relationships with banks, investors, and financial institutions that had opened doors to opportunities the company never could have accessed before. I'd represented Henderson Industries at industry conferences, where my presentations on financial innovation had earned recognition and respect from peers across the sector. The personal cost had been significant. 60-hour work weeks were standard. 70-hour weeks were common during quarterly closings and audit periods. I'd missed family gatherings, postponed vacations, and ended 2 relationships with men who couldn't understand why my career demanded so much of my time and energy. My apartment was nice but modest. Most of my income went into savings and investments rather than luxury purchases. I lived for my work because I believed it mattered. David had encouraged this dedication, praising my commitment and work ethic at every opportunity. "You're the backbone of this company's financial success," he'd told me during my last performance review just 4 months ago. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Now I knew exactly what they'd do without me. They'd replace me with an unqualified family member and hope that 8 years of systems and processes I'd built would continue running on autopilot. They'd gamble the financial stability of a nearly billion-dollar company on nepotism and family. Politics. Looking at that Employee of the Year plaque, I realized how naive I'd been. I'd believed that competence, dedication, and results would always be valued over family connections. I'd trusted that the professional relationship David and I had built over 8 years meant something. I'd assumed that my contributions to the company's success would provide job security and career stability. But sitting in that parking lot with my professional life packed into a cardboard box, I understood that I'd been nothing more than a highly skilled employee who'd outlived her usefulness. The moment keeping me became inconvenient for family politics. 8 years of loyalty and achievement meant absolutely nothing. The Employee of the Year plaque felt heavy in my hands, a reminder of how thoroughly I'd been played. Tyler Henderson's resume had been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks, and every time I looked at it, I felt a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. The document was professionally formatted and impressively lengthy, but anyone with actual financial experience could see through the carefully worded descriptions and inflated accomplishments. MBA in Business Administration, Wharton Business School, the resume proclaimed at the top. Impressive, until you noticed the graduation date was just 18 months ago, and realized that Tyler had no actual work experience before graduate school. The internships listed were at companies owned by Henderson family friends, positions that probably involved more golf outings than financial analysis. Under professional experience, Tyler claimed to be a financial consultant for Henderson Capital Management, a company that I happened to know was David's personal investment firm managing family assets. The job description included phrases like strategic portfolio optimization and comprehensive market analysis, but I suspected Tyler's real duties involved reviewing reports prepared by actual financial professionals and attending meetings, where he nodded along with decisions made by people who understood what they were talking about. Most telling was the list of achievements that included increased portfolio returns by 15% and implemented cost-saving measures resulting in $2.3 million in annual savings. These were exactly the kind of vague, unverifiable claims that looked impressive to people without financial backgrounds, but were meaningless to professionals who understood that such results required specific strategies, detailed analysis, and measurable implementation. David had introduced Tyler to the finance team 4 weeks ago, during what he called a transition planning meeting. Tyler was tall and confident, with the kind of easy charm that came from never having to prove himself. He'd given a brief presentation about his vision for modernizing Henderson Industries' financial operations, using buzzwords like synergy, optimization, and paradigm shifts, without explaining what any of these concepts actually meant, in practical terms. During the Q&A session that followed, my team had asked specific questions about Tyler's experience with financial modeling, regulatory compliance, and risk management. His answers were generic and evasive, the kind of responses that demonstrated he'd read about these topics, but never actually implemented them in real-world situations. "I believe in taking a holistic approach to financial strategy," he'd said. When asked about his experience with SEC reporting requirements, "It's important to consider all stakeholders when developing comprehensive solutions." It was the kind of meaningless corporate speak that said absolutely nothing while trying to sound knowledgeable. After the meeting, my senior analysts had approached me privately with concerns. Lisa, who'd been with the company for 5 years, was particularly direct. "Sarah, he doesn't understand basic financial principles." When I mentioned EBITDA calculations, he looked completely confused. How is he supposed to manage quarterly reporting? Tom, our risk management specialist, was equally worried. I asked him about his experience with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, and he started talking about regulatory optimization. I don't think he even knows what SOX requirements involve. I'd tried to address these concerns with David, suggesting that Tyler might benefit from additional training or a gradual transition period where he could learn the company's specific financial systems and processes. David had dismissed my suggestions with a wave of his hand. "Tyler's got fresh ideas and energy," he'd said. "Sometimes experience can be a limitation. He'll bring new perspectives that we haven't considered. Fresh perspectives. New energy. The same phrases companies used when they wanted to justify hiring someone unqualified for political reasons rather than professional merit. I'd seen it happen at other companies, usually with disastrous results for financial stability and regulatory compliance. What made Tyler's impending appointment even more concerning was the timing. Henderson Industries was in the middle of negotiations for our largest acquisition ever, a deal that would require sophisticated financial modeling and regulatory approval. We were also implementing new accounting software systems that demanded expertise in both technical integration and compliance management. These weren't projects where fresh perspectives mattered more than actual competence. But the most troubling aspect of Tyler's resume wasn't what it said. It was what it revealed about David's priorities. For 8 years, David had emphasized the importance of financial expertise, regulatory compliance, and professional excellence. He'd hired only the most qualified candidates for finance positions, and had always insisted on rigorous standards. For anyone handling company financial data, Now he was preparing to hand over the CFO position to someone whose primary qualification was sharing his last name. Tyler wasn't just unqualified. He was dangerously unqualified for a role that required sophisticated understanding of financial systems, regulatory requirements, and risk management. As I sat in my car that morning, Tyler's resume still in my briefcase, I realized that David's decision to replace me with his nephew wasn't just about family politics. It was about surrounding himself with people who wouldn't ask difficult questions or challenge decisions that might not be in the company's best interests. Someone like Tyler would never notice irregularities in financial reports. He'd never question unusual transactions or investigate discrepancies that didn't make sense. He'd rubber stamp whatever David wanted while providing the appearance of professional financial oversight. And that's when I realized David Henderson might have bigger secrets than just nepotism. 3 days before my termination, I'd been conducting my final quarterly audit when I noticed something that didn't belong in Henderson Industries' financial landscape. The anomalous financial report sat on my desk now, covered with yellow sticky notes and red ink where I'd marked transactions that made no logical sense within our normal business operations. The irregularities started small, hidden within the massive volume of legitimate transactions that flowed through our accounting systems every month. Most CFOs would have missed them entirely, but I'd been working with Henderson Industries' financial patterns for 8 years. I knew the rhythm of our business, seasonal fluctuations, vendor payment cycles, customer payment patterns, and the timing of major expenditures. These transactions didn't fit any of those familiar patterns. The first red flag appeared in our accounts payable section, a series of payments to Meridian Business Solutions, totaling $847,000 over the past 6 months. I'd never heard of Meridian Business Solutions, which was unusual since I personally approved all vendor relationships over $50,000. When I searched our vendor database, Meridian had been added to our approved vendor list just 8 months ago. With minimal documentation and no competitive bidding process, the payments to Meridian were categorized as consulting services, but there were no contracts in our legal files, no project specifications in our operations records, and no deliverables documented anywhere in our systems. Nearly $1 million had been paid to a company for undefined services that nobody in our organization seemed to know anything about. But Meridian wasn't the only suspicious vendor. As I dug deeper into the quarterly records, I found similar payments to Strategic Development Partners, $1.2 million, Global Efficiency Consultants, $734,000, and Innovation Solutions Group, $923,000. All were categorized as consulting or professional services. All had been added to our vendor database within the past year. All had received substantial payments without proper documentation or oversight. When I tried to research these companies online, I found virtually nothing. Meridian Business Solutions had a basic website with generic corporate language about providing strategic solutions for growing businesses, but no specific information about services, leadership, or client testimonials. The other companies had similarly vague websites or no online presence at all. Most concerning was the pattern of payments. These weren't one-time consulting fees or project-based payments. They were regular monthly transfers, always just under the $100,000 threshold that would have required additional board approval. Someone had structured these payments to avoid triggering our internal controls while extracting millions of dollars from company accounts. I spent hours tracing the payment authorizations through our approval systems. Every suspicious transaction had been approved by David Henderson personally, using his executive override authority to bypass the normal vendor verification processes. This wasn't accidental or careless. It was deliberate circumvention of financial controls I'd implemented to prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized spending. The timing was also suspicious. Most of these questionable vendors had been added to our systems shortly after Tyler started visiting the office regularly. The payments began around the same time David started talking about organizational changes and fresh perspectives in leadership positions. As I compiled my findings, the scope of the potential fraud became clearer. Over the past 12 months, Henderson Industries had paid approximately $4.7 million to companies that appeared to provide no actual services. The money had simply disappeared from our accounts into what looked like a network of shell companies designed to hide the ultimate destination of the funds. But what really made my blood run cold was the realization that this was probably just the tip of the iceberg. If David was willing to steal nearly $5 million through obvious fake vendors, what else might he be hiding in the more complex areas of our financial operations? International transactions, investment accounts, subsidiary company transfers. There were dozens of ways to hide money in a company as large and complex as Henderson Industries. I made copies of every suspicious document, saved all the electronic records to an encrypted flash drive, and began building a comprehensive file of evidence. If David Henderson thought he could steal millions from his own company and cover it up by replacing me with his incompetent nephew, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The anomalous financial report wasn't just evidence of fraud. It was proof that David's decision to fire me had nothing to do with organizational changes or fresh perspectives. He needed me gone, because I was getting too close to discovering what he'd been hiding. As I sat in my car that morning, looking at the building where I'd dedicated 8 years of my life, I realized that David Henderson hadn't just betrayed my trust and loyalty. He'd been systematically stealing from the company while I was working 60-hour weeks to improve its financial performance. But what I discovered next would make those millions look like pocket change. That evening, I spread the bank routing numbers I'd discovered across my kitchen table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Each number represented a financial institution somewhere in the world, and following their trail would reveal the true scope of David Henderson's criminal enterprise. What I'd initially thought was simple vendor fraud was actually a sophisticated, international money laundering operation. The routing numbers fell into distinct patterns that told a story of careful planning and systematic theft. Domestic transfers went through smaller regional banks in states with limited oversight requirements. International transfers flowed through financial institutions in countries known for banking secrecy: Switzerland, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and several Eastern European nations with emerging banking sectors. Using my access to financial databases that wouldn't expire until the end of the month, I began tracing each routing number to its corresponding institution. What I discovered was a carefully constructed network designed to obscure the ultimate destination of Henderson Industries' money while making the transfers appear legitimate on surface inspection. The domestic routing numbers belonged to 3 small banks in Nevada, Delaware, and Wyoming, states chosen specifically for their business-friendly regulations and minimal reporting requirements. These banks served as the first step in the money laundering process, receiving funds from Henderson Industries for consulting services before quickly transferring the money to international accounts. The international routing numbers revealed the sophistication of David's operation. Funds flowed from those domestic banks to institutions in Geneva, where they were immediately transferred to accounts in Singapore. From Singapore, the money moved to the Cayman Islands, then to banks in Estonia and Latvia, before finally arriving at what appeared to be the end destinations. Each transfer was carefully structured to avoid triggering international reporting requirements. No single transaction exceeded $9,000, staying just below the $10,000 threshold that would have required currency transaction reports. The timing of transfers was irregular, avoiding patterns that might attract attention from financial intelligence units. Most ingeniously, the money didn't simply disappear into personal accounts. David had created a network of shell companies at each stage of the transfer process, companies with legitimate-sounding names and basic business registrations, but no actual operations. Meridian Business Solutions was just one company in a buy chain that included Baltic Strategic Partners, Alpine Investment Holdings, and Pacific Development Corporation. The shell companies provided plausible explanations for every transfer. Meridian paid Baltic Strategic Partners for market research services. Baltic paid Alpine Investment Holdings for portfolio management. Alpine paid Pacific Development Corporation for international business development. Each transaction looked reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a money laundering operation that had moved millions of dollars out of Henderson Industries. Following, the trail to its ultimate destination required accessing international banking databases that were technically beyond my authorized access level. But Henderson Industries had corporate accounts with several major international banks, and my CFO credentials still provided access to transaction monitoring systems that could trace correspondent banking relationships. What I found at the end of the money trail shocked me even more than the sophisticated laundering scheme. The funds weren't disappearing into anonymous offshore accounts. They were flowing into a complex web of investments and holdings controlled by Henderson family members, including David's wife Margaret, his brother Robert, and yes, Tyler Henderson. The money was being used to purchase real estate in Miami and Los Angeles, invest in private equity funds, buy luxury assets like yachts and art collections, and fund lifestyle expenses that far exceeded what the Henderson family's legitimate income could support. David wasn't just stealing money, he was building a family empire funded by systematic theft from his own company. The scope was staggering. Over the past 3 years, I could trace approximately $47 million that had flowed through this laundering network. But the transaction patterns suggested the operation had been running much longer, probably since shortly after I became CFO, and implemented more sophisticated financial tracking systems that ironically made it easier to hide fraud within legitimate business operations. The handwritten list of routing numbers I'd compiled represented more than just bank accounts. It was a roadmap to the largest corporate fraud case I'd ever encountered. David Henderson hadn't just betrayed my trust and stolen my job. He'd been running a criminal enterprise under my nose while I worked to improve the financial performance of the company he was systematically robbing. As I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of massive financial crimes, I realized that David's decision to fire me wasn't about nepotism or organizational changes. I was getting too close to discovering his money laundering operation. Tyler wasn't being hired for his qualifications. He was being installed because he was family and could be trusted to ignore the obvious signs of fraud that I would never have overlooked. But David Henderson had made a crucial mistake. In firing me to protect his criminal enterprise, he'd created an enemy with detailed knowledge of his financial operations and absolute proof of his crimes. The routing numbers spread across my table weren't just evidence. They were David Henderson's pathway to federal prison, and I was going to make sure he took that journey. The master spreadsheet took me 3 sleepless nights to complete, but when I finished, I had created the most comprehensive documentation of corporate fraud I'd ever seen. Every suspicious transaction, every shell company, every international transfer, and every family member benefit was meticulously recorded in a format that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. The spreadsheet contained 47 separate worksheets, each documenting a different aspect of David Henderson's criminal enterprise. The main summary sheet showed the devastating totals: $127 million stolen from Henderson Industries over the past 5 years through a sophisticated network of fake vendors, shell companies, and international money laundering operations. $127 million. The number was so large, it seemed almost abstract until I considered what it represented. Henderson Industries employed 847 people, whose jobs, benefits, and retirement savings depended on the company's financial stability. David had stolen enough money to fund the annual salaries of every single employee for more than 2 years. The vendor fraud worksheet documented 312 payments to 27 different fake companies, totaling $23.4 million. Each entry included the vendor name, payment amount, supposed service description, approval date, and the real destination of the funds. Companies like Meridian Business Solutions and Strategic Development Partners were revealed as nothing more than bank accounts designed to facilitate theft. The international transfers worksheet was even more damning, showing how $89.7 million had been moved through a network of offshore banks to avoid detection and taxation. I'd traced every transfer through correspondent banking relationships, documenting the sophisticated money laundering techniques David had used to obscure the stolen funds' ultimate destination. Most shocking was the family benefits worksheet, which detailed how Henderson family members had received $47.2 million in direct and indirect benefits from the stolen money. Margaret Henderson's consulting company had received $8.4 million for undefined services. Robert Henderson's investment firm had been paid $12.7 million for financial advisory work that never occurred. Tyler Henderson had received $2.1 million through various shell companies before he'd even started working at Henderson Industries. The real estate purchases alone were staggering. David had used stolen company funds to buy a $4.2 million mansion in Malibu, a $3.8 million penthouse in Manhattan, and a $2.1 million vacation home in the Hamptons. Margaret Henderson owned a yacht worth $5.7 million and a private jet valued at $8.3 million, all purchased with money stolen from the company while I was working 60-hour weeks to improve financial performance. But the most sophisticated aspect of David's fraud was how he'd hidden it within legitimate business operations. Rather than simply writing checks to himself, he'd created fake business relationships that provided plausible explanations for every transfer. Consulting fees for companies that provided no services, investment management charges for portfolio, supervision that never occurred, Strategic planning payments for advice that was never given. The fraud had escalated significantly after I became CFO, not because David was getting bolder, but because the improved financial systems I'd implemented made it easier to hide fraudulent transactions within the massive volume of legitimate business activity. The sophisticated tracking and reporting tools I'd proudly installed to improve financial oversight had been turned into weapons for systematic theft. David had also exploited the trust and autonomy I'd been given as CFO. My focus on improving efficiency and reducing bureaucratic obstacles had created streamlined approval processes that David could manipulate to authorize fraudulent payments. The executive override authorities I'd supported to improve operational flexibility had become tools for bypassing financial controls. Most infuriating was the realization that David had been stealing money while praising my work and encouraging my dedication. Every late night I'd spent optimizing financial systems. Every weekend I'd worked to improve quarterly reports. Every vacation I'd postponed to handle urgent financial matters. David had been using my efforts to facilitate his criminal enterprise. The timeline in my spreadsheet showed that the fraud had accelerated dramatically in recent months, coinciding with Tyler's increased presence around the office. I could now see that David hadn't been preparing Tyler to replace me because of family preference. He'd been training his nephew to be a complicit CFO who would help expand and protect the money laundering operation. Tyler's lack of qualifications wasn't a bug in David's plan. It was a feature. Someone with actual financial expertise might notice the obvious signs of fraud that I'd discovered. Tyler would rubber stamp whatever David wanted, while providing the appearance of independent financial oversight that could satisfy auditors and regulators. As I reviewed the completed master spreadsheet, I felt a mixture of professional pride and personal rage. I'd created bulletproof documentation of criminal activity that spanned multiple years and involved dozens of separate violations of federal law. This wasn't simple embezzlement. It was organized crime operating under the cover of legitimate business. But I'd also documented the betrayal of everything I'd worked to build at Henderson Industries. Every financial improvement, every efficiency gain, every system enhancement I'd implemented had been corrupted and exploited for criminal purposes. David Henderson hadn't just stolen my job. He'd perverted my professional accomplishments into tools for systematic theft. The master spreadsheet represented more than evidence of fraud. It was my declaration of war against David Henderson, and everyone who'd participated in betraying the company and employees I'd dedicated 8 years of my life to protecting. David Henderson's personal financial statements, which I'd accessed through his executive expense account records, told a story of impossible wealth accumulation that could only be explained by systematic theft. The documents I'd printed and spread across my dining room table revealed a lifestyle funded by money stolen from the company where I'd been working 60-hour weeks for modest compensation. According to his most recent personal financial disclosure, required for the company's insurance policies, David claimed a net worth of $47 million. For someone whose legitimate salary as CEO was $850,000 annually, accumulating that level of wealth would have required decades of perfect investing and zero personal expenses. But David had only been CEO for 12 years, and his previous positions had paid significantly less. The math simply didn't work, unless you factored in the $127 million he'd stolen from Henderson Industries. David's asset portfolio read like a catalog of luxury purchases that most people could only dream about. The Malibu mansion, valued at $4.2 million, sat on 3 acres of oceanfront property, with a private beach, infinity pool, and guest house larger than most family homes. Property records showed he'd paid cash for the purchase, despite having no obvious source for that level of liquid assets. The Manhattan penthouse was even more extravagant. 4,200 square feet of luxury living space in a building where the monthly maintenance fees exceeded most people's annual salaries. David had purchased the property for $3.8 million and spent an additional $1.2 million on renovations that included a wine cellar, home theater, and private elevator access. Again, he'd paid cash for both the purchase and improvements. But the real estate was just the beginning. David's financial statements listed ownership of a 67-foot yacht named Henderson's Dream, custom-built by a prestigious Italian shipyard and valued at $5.7 million. The yacht featured 5 staterooms, a full galley, satellite communications, and all the amenities needed for extended ocean voyages. Monthly maintenance and docking fees alone exceeded $47,000. The private jet was perhaps the most outrageous example of David's stolen luxury lifestyle. The Bombardier Global 6000, purchased for $8.3 million, provided transcontinental range and accommodations for up to 14 passengers. Operating costs for the aircraft exceeded $4,000 per flight hour, meaning that David's weekend trips to his various properties cost more than most people earned in a month. Margaret Henderson's financial profile was equally suspicious. Her consulting company, Henderson Strategic Advisors, claimed to provide management consulting services to mid-size businesses, but I'd found no evidence of actual clients or deliverable services. Despite this lack of apparent business activity, Henderson Strategic Advisors had reported $8.4 million in revenue over the past 3 years, money that had flowed directly from Henderson Industries through fake consulting contracts. Margaret used her stolen consulting income to fund a lifestyle that would have been impossible on her husband's legitimate salary. She owned a collection of luxury automobiles worth more than $700,000, including a Bentley Continental, a Porsche 911 Turbo, and a customized Range Rover. Her jewelry collection, insured for $1.3 million, featured pieces from Cartier, Harry Winston, and other high-end designers. Robert Henderson, David's brother, had been even more creative in his theft methodologies. His investment management firm, Henderson Capital Strategies, claimed to provide portfolio management services for high-net-worth individuals. In reality, Robert had been paid $12.7 million by Henderson Industries for managing investment portfolios that didn't exist, providing financial advice that was never given, and conducting market analysis that was never performed. Robert had used his stolen funds to purchase a horse farm in Kentucky, complete with training facilities and breeding operations that seemed designed more for tax avoidance than legitimate business purposes. The farm, valued at $6.2 million, provided Robert with the lifestyle of a country gentleman while generating losses that offset his stolen income for tax purposes. But the most infuriating discovery was Tyler Henderson's financial profile. Despite having virtually no legitimate work experience and no apparent skills or qualifications, Tyler had somehow accumulated assets worth more than $2.1 million before his 27th birthday. His financial statements showed ownership of a luxury condominium in downtown Chicago, a portfolio of investment accounts, and a trust fund that provided monthly income exceeding what most experienced professionals earned annually. Tyler's wealth had been accumulated through payments from various Henderson family shell companies for business development services, strategic consulting, and market research activities that clearly never occurred. In essence, the Henderson family had been paying Tyler millions of dollars in stolen money to prepare him for his role as a complicit CFO who would help expand and protect their criminal enterprise. The financial statements also revealed the sophisticated tax avoidance strategies the Henderson family had employed to minimize the consequences of their stolen wealth. Purchases were made through various business entities to generate tax deductions. Assets were held in family trusts to avoid estate taxes. Income was shifted between family members to take advantage of lower tax brackets. David Henderson hadn't just stolen $127 million from his own company. He'd used that stolen money to build a family dynasty of wealth and privilege while avoiding most of the tax consequences that legitimate earners would face. He'd corrupted every aspect of business ownership, from employee relations to tax obligations, in service of his criminal enterprise. As I reviewed these financial statements, I realized that my termination wasn't just about protecting David's fraud scheme. It was about protecting a multi-generational wealth transfer built entirely on stolen money. David wasn't just a CEO who'd embezzled funds. He was the patriarch of a criminal family organization that had systematically looted Henderson Industries to fund their luxury lifestyles. But their financial statements would also be their downfall, providing federal prosecutors with detailed documentation of assets that could only have been acquired through criminal activity. The deleted email chain I recovered from Henderson Industries' backup servers revealed the most damning evidence yet, proof that my termination had been carefully planned months in advance as part of covering up the family's criminal enterprise. The internal communications between David, Margaret, Robert, and Tyler Henderson showed a criminal conspiracy that made my professional betrayal seem almost secondary to their larger crimes. The email recovery had been possible because of my administrative access to the company's IT systems, access that wouldn't expire until the end of the month. Henderson Industries maintained comprehensive backup systems for legal compliance purposes, systems I'd personally recommended to protect against data loss and ensure regulatory compliance. Now, those same systems were providing evidence that would destroy the Henderson family. The earliest email in the chain was dated 7 months ago, sent from David to Margaret with the subject line, "Sarah problem, need discussion." The message was brief but revealing. Sarah's quarterly review identified some vendor payment irregularities. Nothing specific yet, but she's asking questions about consulting contracts. We need to discuss timeline for transition plan. Margaret's response, sent within hours, was equally incriminating. Tyler will be ready for CFO position by end of year. Can you accelerate his training schedule? We can't afford to have Sarah digging deeper into the vendor arrangements. 2. Much exposure risk. The email chain documented months of family discussions about my growing proximity to their fraud scheme and their need to remove me before I discovered the full scope of their criminal activities. References to vendor irregularities, exposure risks, and transition timelines made it clear that my termination wasn't a business decision. It was a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice. Robert Henderson had been particularly blunt in his assessment of the risks I represented. In an email sent 6 weeks before my termination, he wrote, "Sarah's financial analysis capabilities are too sophisticated for our current arrangements. She's already identified several consulting payments that can't be explained through normal business operations. Tyler needs to be in position ASAP." Tyler's own emails revealed his understanding that he was being installed as CFO specifically to facilitate and protect the family's criminal activities. In a message to his uncle Robert, Tyler had written, "I understand my role will involve more than traditional CFO responsibilities. Dad has explained the family business arrangements that require discretionary oversight. I'm prepared to handle these matters appropriately." The phrase family business arrangements was clearly code for the money laundering and fraud operations that had stolen $127 million from Henderson Industries. Tyler wasn't being hired despite his lack of qualifications. He was being hired because his family loyalty would ensure he'd protect criminal activities that a qualified CFO would be obligated to report to authorities. Most revealing was an email exchange between David and Tyler discussing specific strategies for concealing fraudulent transactions once Tyler became CFO. David had written, "The consulting vendor payments will need to be restructured once you take over. Sarah's documentation systems are too detailed for our purposes. We'll need to implement more flexible arrangements." Tyler's response showed his willingness to participate in criminal activity. "I've reviewed the current vendor contracts and payment systems. There are several adjustments we can make to reduce documentation requirements while maintaining plausible business justifications. I can have new procedures ready for implementation within 30 days of starting." The email chain also documented the Henderson family's awareness that their criminal activities constituted serious federal crimes. In a message discussing the risks of discovery, Margaret had written, "Money laundering charges carry 20-year sentences. We can't afford any exposure at this level of operation. Sarah's removal is essential for family protection." Robert's response had been even more explicit about the criminal nature of their activities. The offshore transfers alone constitute multiple felony violations. If Sarah connects the international banking relationships to our domestic shell companies, we're looking at RICO charges for the entire family operation. RICO charges, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, designed to prosecute organized crime families and criminal enterprises. The Henderson family wasn't just committing fraud. They were operating like a mafia organization that had infiltrated legitimate business operations. The emails also revealed the sophisticated legal advice the Henderson family had received about protecting their criminal enterprise. References to discussions with offshore counsel and asset protection specialists showed they'd invested substantial resources in learning how to hide stolen money and avoid criminal prosecution. In one particularly damning email, David had forwarded advice from their attorney about witness protection. Eliminate any employee access to comprehensive financial records. Compartmentalize information so no single individual can reconstruct complete transaction patterns. Sarah's current access level represents unacceptable exposure risk. This wasn't accidental embezzlement or opportunistic theft. It was a carefully planned criminal enterprise with legal consultation, risk management strategies, and systematic approaches to avoiding detection. The Henderson family had turned corporate crime into a professional operation with the same level of planning and expertise that legitimate businesses applied to operational efficiency. The final emails in the chain discussed specific plans for my termination and Tyler's installation as CFO. David had written, "Termination scheduled for Tuesday morning. Tyler begins orientation Wednesday. All vendor payment authorizations transfer immediately. Sarah's access terminated same day to prevent any transition documentation." Margaret's response confirmed their understanding that my termination was part of covering up criminal activity. Tyler's first priority should be restructuring the consulting arrangements to eliminate Sarah's documentation trail. We need those payment records sanitized within the first week. The email chain provided absolute proof that David Henderson had committed multiple federal crimes: conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and operating a criminal enterprise under the RICO statute. Every member of the Henderson family had participated in the conspiracy, from planning my termination to restructuring criminal operations to avoid detection. But most importantly, the emails proved that my termination wasn't a legitimate business decision. It was a criminal act designed to obstruct a federal investigation that hadn't even begun yet. David Henderson had fired me specifically to prevent discovery of his crimes, making my termination itself a felony obstruction of justice charge. As I printed copies of every email in the chain, I realized I now possessed evidence that would not only expose the Henderson family's financial crimes, but also prove that my termination was part of a criminal conspiracy. Federal prosecutors wouldn't just be interested in the money laundering and fraud. They'd also pursue additional charges for the cover-up attempt that had cost me my job and career. The deleted email chain had given me something even more valuable than evidence of fraud. It had given me proof that David Henderson had destroyed my professional life as part of a criminal conspiracy, making me not just a whistleblower, but a victim of federal crimes who deserved both justice and compensation for the damage his criminal enterprise had caused. The evidence portfolio I assembled over the following week was the most comprehensive documentation of corporate fraud I'd ever seen, and I'd spent 8 years reviewing financial investigations as part of my CFO responsibilities. The thick binder contained 847 pages of evidence that would make federal prosecutors' careers and send the entire Henderson family to prison for decades. The portfolio was organized like a legal brief, with executive summaries, detailed evidence sections, and supporting documentation that told the complete story of the Henderson family's criminal enterprise. Each section built systematically on the previous evidence, creating an overwhelming case that no defense attorney could effectively challenge. Section 1 documented the vendor fraud scheme with 312 separate transactions totaling $23.4 million. Every fake vendor was exposed with corporate registration records, showing shell companies with no legitimate business operations. Bank account information revealed that payments to companies like Meridian Business Solutions were immediately transferred to Henderson family-controlled accounts within hours of receipt. Section 2 detailed the international money laundering operation with complete transaction records, showing how $89.7 million had been moved through offshore banks to avoid detection and taxation. The routing number analysis I'd completed traced every transfer through correspondent banking relationships, demonstrating the sophisticated techniques David had used to obscure the stolen funds' ultimate destination. Section 3 contained the Henderson family's personal financial statements, showing assets and lifestyles that could only have been funded through criminal activity. Real estate purchases, luxury assets, and investment portfolios that far exceeded their legitimate income capacity were documented with property records, insurance valuations, and financial disclosures that proved the connection between stolen company funds and family wealth. Section 4 was perhaps the most damning, the deleted email chain showing the criminal conspiracy to remove me from my position, specifically to prevent discovery of their fraud scheme. The communications between David, Margaret, Robert, and Tyler Henderson provided absolute proof of criminal intent and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Section 5 contained Tyler Henderson's fabricated resume and employment records showing his lack of qualifications for the CFO position, along with evidence of his financial benefits from the family's criminal enterprise. This section proved that Tyler's appointment wasn't based on merit, but on his willingness to participate in covering up criminal activity. Section 6 documented the timeline of events showing how the fraud had escalated after I implemented improved financial controls as CFO, rather than preventing crime. My enhanced systems had been exploited to facilitate more sophisticated theft, while providing plausible explanations for fraudulent transactions. The supporting materials included bank records, corporate filings, property deeds, insurance policies, tax returns, and regulatory filings that corroborated every aspect of the fraud scheme. I'd created a legal case that was so thoroughly documented that defense attorneys would have no choice but to negotiate plea agreements rather than risk trial. But the evidence portfolio was more than just documentation of crimes. It was my roadmap for seeking justice and vindication for the betrayal I'd suffered. Every page represented hours of investigation work that proved my professional competence and dedication to ethical financial practices. The Henderson family had destroyed my career to protect their criminal enterprise, but the evidence I'd compiled would restore my reputation while exposing their crimes. I'd also documented the broader impact of the Henderson family's criminal activities on Henderson Industries and its employees. The $127 million they'd stolen represented funds that could have been used for employee benefits, facility improvements, research and development, or business expansion. Instead, 847 employees had been unknowingly working to fund the Henderson family's luxury lifestyle while receiving modest compensation and limited benefits. The economic analysis I'd included showed how the theft had artificially deflated the company's financial performance, limiting opportunities for employee raises, profit-sharing distributions, and career advancement. The Henderson family hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen opportunities and financial security from every person who worked at Henderson Industries. Most importantly, the evidence portfolio established my credibility as a whistleblower who had discovered criminal activity through legitimate professional responsibilities rather than any improper access to confidential information. Every document I'd included was something I'd had legitimate reasons to review as CFO, and my investigation had followed standard financial analysis procedures that any competent CFO would have employed. The portfolio also documented the sophisticated nature of the crimes, proving that this wasn't simple embezzlement or opportunistic theft, but an organized criminal enterprise that had operated for years with legal consultation and risk management strategies. This level of sophistication would support RICO charges that carried enhanced penalties and would allow prosecutors to seize all assets purchased with stolen funds. As I reviewed the completed evidence portfolio, I felt a sense of professional pride mixed with personal satisfaction. I'd applied the same analytical skills and attention to detail that had made me an excellent CFO to documenting the crimes that had cost me my career. The Henderson family had underestimated my capabilities and determination, assuming they could silence me by destroying my professional life. But they'd made a crucial mistake. In trying to protect their criminal enterprise by removing me from my position, they'd created an enemy with the skills, knowledge, and evidence necessary to expose everything they'd tried to hide. The evidence portfolio wasn't just documentation of their crimes. It was my declaration of war against corruption and my roadmap to justice. The SEC whistleblower guidelines document I downloaded from the Securities and Exchange Commission website opened my eyes to possibilities I hadn't considered when I first discovered the Henderson family's criminal activities. The federal government didn't just want information about securities fraud. They were prepared to pay substantial financial rewards to whistleblowers who provided evidence leading to successful enforcement actions. According to the guidelines, whistleblowers could receive between 10% and 30% of the monetary sanctions collected in cases where the government recovered more than $1 million. With $127 million in documented fraud, my potential reward could range from $12.7 million to $38.1 million. The Henderson family had unknowingly created a financial incentive for me to expose their crimes that would dwarf any severance package or wrongful termination settlement. But the financial rewards were just one aspect of the comprehensive whistleblower protections that federal law provided. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act and Dodd-Frank Act created multiple layers of protection for employees who reported securities violations, including protections against retaliation, reinstatement rights, and compensation for damages suffered as a result of reporting criminal activity. Most importantly for my situation, the guidelines specifically protected employees who were terminated for discovering or reporting securities violations. My termination by David Henderson specifically to prevent discovery of fraud wasn't just wrongful. It was a federal crime that carried additional penalties beyond the underlying fraud charges. The SEC guidelines also outlined the types of evidence that were most valuable for enforcement actions. High-quality documentary evidence like the materials I'd compiled was exactly what federal investigators needed to build cases that could withstand aggressive defense strategies. My background as a CFO with detailed knowledge of financial systems made me an ideal witness who could explain complex fraud schemes to juries and regulatory authorities. Reading through the eligibility requirements, I realized that my situation was almost perfectly suited for whistleblower protection and rewards. I'd discovered the fraud through legitimate job responsibilities as CFO. I'd been terminated specifically to prevent reporting of criminal activity. I'd compiled comprehensive evidence documenting multiple violations of federal securities laws. I had detailed knowledge of the criminal enterprise and could provide testimony that would be essential for successful prosecution. The guidelines also explained the process for submitting whistleblower complaints and the protections available. During investigation periods, the SEC maintained strict confidentiality protections for whistleblower identities and provided secure channels for submitting evidence without alerting targets of investigations. Federal prosecutors could also provide witness protection and security measures if whistleblowers faced threats or intimidation. Most encouraging was the track record of successful whistleblower cases that had resulted in substantial monetary recoveries and criminal prosecutions. The SEC had paid out more than $1 billion in whistleblower awards since 2010, with individual awards reaching as high as $114 million for cases involving sophisticated fraud schemes similar to what I'd discovered at Henderson Industries. The guidelines made it clear that my case had several characteristics that federal prosecutors particularly valued. Multi-year fraud schemes involving international money laundering were high-priority targets for federal enforcement agencies. Cases involving family criminal enterprises could support RICO prosecutions that carried enhanced penalties and asset forfeiture provisions. Evidence of systematic violation of internal controls and audit procedures demonstrated the kind of willful misconduct that warranted maximum criminal penalties. But beyond the financial rewards and legal protections, the whistleblower guidelines represented something more important: validation that what I discovered was exactly the kind of criminal activity that federal law was designed to prevent and punish. The Henderson family hadn't just violated company policies or ethical standards. They'd committed serious federal crimes that threatened the integrity of financial markets and investor confidence. The guidelines also clarified that my termination for discovering fraud made me a victim of federal crimes in addition to being a witness to the Henderson family's criminal enterprise. This dual status would entitle me to additional protections and compensation beyond the standard whistleblower rewards, including potential civil litigation against Henderson Industries for wrongful termination and violation of whistleblower protection laws. Reading through case studies of successful whistleblower prosecutions, I saw patterns that matched my situation almost exactly. CFOs and financial executives who discovered fraud, attempted to address it through internal channels, and were subsequently terminated for their discoveries, had consistently received the highest levels of whistleblower protection and financial rewards. The federal government had a strong interest in encouraging financial professionals to report criminal activity, rather than remain silent out of fear for their careers. My case would send a message to other corporate executives that discovering and reporting fraud would be rewarded rather than punished, supporting broader efforts to prevent securities violations through internal oversight. As I finished reading the SEC guidelines, I realized that David Henderson's decision to fire me had transformed me from a potential internal whistleblower into a federal witness with maximum legal protections and financial incentives to seek justice. The Henderson family had assumed they could silence me by destroying my career, but federal law had turned their retaliation into additional crimes that would enhance their criminal penalties while providing me with both protection and compensation. The SEC whistleblower guidelines weren't just legal documents. They were my roadmap to justice and financial recovery that would exceed anything I could have achieved through my destroyed career at Henderson Industries. The official complaint filing I submitted to the SEC was the culmination of 2 weeks of intensive preparation and the most important document I'd ever written in my professional career. The formal submission, complete with my 847-page evidence portfolio, represented my transformation from victim of corporate crime to active participant in seeking federal justice against the Henderson family criminal enterprise. The SEC's online whistleblower portal was surprisingly sophisticated, designed to handle complex fraud cases with multiple supporting documents and detailed narrative explanations. The system allowed me to upload my entire evidence portfolio while maintaining strict confidentiality protections that would prevent the Henderson family from discovering my identity until federal investigators were ready to proceed with formal enforcement actions. My complaint narrative began with a comprehensive executive summary that outlined the scope and sophistication of the crimes I'd discovered. Henderson Industries CEO David Henderson and his family members have operated a criminal enterprise for approximately 5 years, stealing $127 million through vendor fraud, international money laundering, and systematic violation of internal financial controls. The complainant was terminated as CFO specifically to prevent discovery and reporting of these criminal activities. The detailed sections of my complaint walked federal investigators through each aspect of the criminal scheme with specific references to supporting evidence in my portfolio. The vendor fraud section documented 312 fraudulent transactions with complete bank records showing how payments to fake companies were immediately transferred to Henderson family accounts. The money laundering section traced $89.7 million through international banking networks with routing numbers and correspondent bank relationships that prove systematic efforts to hide stolen funds offshore. Most importantly, I documented my professional qualifications and the legitimate circumstances that had led to discovering the criminal activities. My 8-year tenure as CFO, my responsibility for financial oversight and audit procedures, and my access to the financial records that revealed the fraud established my credibility as a whistleblower who had discovered criminal activity through proper professional channels, rather than any improper investigation. The retaliation section of my complaint provided detailed evidence that my termination was specifically motivated by David Henderson's fear that I would discover and report his criminal activities. The deleted email chain between Henderson family members discussing the Sarah problem and their need to remove me before I identified vendor payment irregularities provided absolute proof that my termination was a criminal act designed to obstruct justice. I also documented the broader impact of the Henderson family's crimes on Henderson Industries and its 847 employees. The $127 million theft represented stolen wages, benefits, and opportunities that should have been available to workers who had unknowingly been funding the Henderson family's luxury lifestyle through their labor and dedication. The complaint included detailed calculations of the financial harm suffered by Henderson Industries, its shareholders, and its employees as a result of the systematic theft. Beyond the direct monetary losses, the criminal activities had artificially deflated the company's financial performance, limiting opportunities for business expansion, employee advancement, and profit-sharing distributions. My personal damages section documented the career harm I'd suffered as a direct result of discovering and attempting to address the criminal activities. My termination had destroyed my professional reputation, eliminated my income, and damaged my career prospects in the financial industry. The complaint established my status as both a whistleblower, deserving of protection, and a victim of federal crimes entitled to compensation for damages. The complaint also addressed the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise, providing evidence that supported potential RICO charges against the Henderson family, the systematic coordination between family members, the use of legal consultation to structure criminal activities, and the multi-year operation of the fraud scheme demonstrated the kind of organized criminal activity that warranted enhanced federal penalties. Most importantly, my complaint demonstrated the urgent need for federal intervention to prevent ongoing criminal activity. With Tyler Henderson now installed as CFO specifically to facilitate and conceal continued fraud, Henderson Industries remained under the control of a criminal enterprise that would continue stealing from the company and its employees without immediate law enforcement action. The submission process included multiple security measures designed to protect whistleblower confidentiality while ensuring the integrity of evidence provided to federal investigators. Digital signatures, encrypted file transfers, and secure communication channels prevented unauthorized access to my complaint, while creating an official record of my cooperation with federal law enforcement. After submitting the complaint, I received an automated confirmation with a unique case number and secure contact information for the SEC investigation team that would review my evidence. The system also provided updates on the timeline for initial review and the process for additional cooperation as the investigation proceeded. The official complaint filing represented more than just a legal document. It was my formal declaration that the Henderson family's criminal enterprise would face the full force of federal law enforcement. David Henderson had assumed he could silence me by destroying my career, but my complaint had transformed his retaliation into additional evidence of criminal activity that would enhance his eventual prosecution. As I received confirmation that my complaint had been successfully submitted, I felt a sense of satisfaction and anticipation I hadn't experienced since discovering the original fraud. The Henderson family's criminal enterprise was about to face investigation by federal agencies with the resources, authority, and determination to seek justice for their crimes against Henderson Industries, and everyone who had been harmed by their systematic theft and corruption. The FBI search warrant arrived at Henderson Industries like a thunderbolt on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd submitted my whistleblower complaint to the SEC. The legal document, signed by a federal judge and authorizing comprehensive investigation of the Henderson family's criminal enterprise, validated everything I'd discovered and documented in my evidence portfolio. Federal agents executed the search warrant with military precision, arriving simultaneously at Henderson Industries' corporate headquarters, David Henderson's personal residences, and the offices of the various shell companies that had been used to launder stolen funds. More than 40 FBI agents and financial crimes specialists participated in the coordinated operation that marked the beginning of the most significant corporate fraud investigation in our region's history. The search warrant itself was a comprehensive document that specifically referenced my whistleblower complaint and described the criminal activities I'd documented with remarkable accuracy. Federal investigators had clearly reviewed my evidence portfolio thoroughly and had found my documentation sufficiently compelling to justify the extensive law enforcement resources being deployed against the Henderson family. The warrant authorized seizure of financial records, computer systems, bank account information, real estate documentation, and personal assets that might have been purchased with stolen funds. Federal agents had the authority to freeze Henderson family bank accounts, prevent the transfer or sale of luxury assets, and secure all evidence related to the multi-year criminal enterprise. Most satisfying was the specific language in the warrant that referenced my termination as evidence of obstruction of justice. The document stated that Henderson Industries CFO Sarah Mitchell was terminated specifically to prevent discovery and reporting of criminal activities, constituting additional federal crimes beyond the underlying fraud scheme. My firing had been officially recognized as a criminal act that enhanced the charges against David Henderson. The investigation team included specialists from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, SEC enforcement attorneys, and prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office who specialized in complex corporate fraud cases. The level of federal resources being deployed indicated that investigators considered the Henderson family's criminal enterprise a high-priority case worthy of maximum enforcement efforts. Within hours of the search warrant execution, news of the investigation had leaked to local media outlets. Henderson Industries' stock price plummeted as investors reacted to reports of federal agents seizing financial records and computer systems from corporate headquarters. Employees gathered in shocked groups, trying to understand how their company had become the target of a major federal criminal investigation. Tyler Henderson, who had been CFO for less than 3 weeks, was reportedly escorted from the building by federal agents after attempting to delete files from his computer system. His panicked efforts to destroy evidence only provided additional proof of criminal intent and obstruction of justice, validating my assessment that he'd been installed specifically to facilitate and conceal ongoing criminal activity. David Henderson's attorney issued a brief statement claiming that the investigation was based on disgruntled employee allegations and expressing confidence that the charges would be fully refuted through the legal process. But federal investigators don't execute search warrants based on employee complaints unless they have compelling evidence of serious criminal activity. The search warrant also authorized investigation of Margaret Henderson's consulting company, Robert Henderson's investment management firm, and the various offshore banking relationships that had been used to launder stolen funds internationally. Federal investigators were clearly pursuing a comprehensive case against the entire Henderson family criminal enterprise rather than limiting their focus to David's individual crimes. Most importantly, the search warrant established my credibility and vindicated my decision to become a federal whistleblower. The FBI doesn't waste resources investigating corporate fraud cases unless they have reliable evidence from credible sources. My background as Henderson Industries CFO and my comprehensive documentation of the criminal activities had provided federal prosecutors with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to build a case that could withstand aggressive defense strategies. Type 2 warrant execution also triggered additional protections for my safety and security as a federal witness. FBI agents contacted me within hours of the search to discuss witness protection measures and to schedule formal interviews about my evidence and testimony. Federal law enforcement was treating me as a valuable witness whose cooperation would be essential for successful prosecution of the Henderson family. The investigation timeline outlined in the warrant suggested that federal prosecutors expected to file formal criminal charges within 60 days of completing their evidence review. With my comprehensive documentation providing a roadmap for the investigation, Federal agents wouldn't need months of financial analysis to understand the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise. The search warrant also provided legal authority for asset forfeiture procedures that would allow the federal government to seize and liquidate Henderson family assets purchased with stolen funds. The Malibu mansion, Manhattan penthouse, yacht, private jet, and other luxury assets would be sold to provide restitution for Henderson Industries and compensation for the employees who had been harmed by the systematic theft. As I watched news coverage of federal agents executing search warrants at multiple Henderson family properties, I felt a sense of vindication and justice that I hadn't experienced since discovering the original fraud. The search warrant wasn't just a legal document. It was official recognition that the Henderson family's criminal enterprise would face the full consequences of federal law enforcement, and that my decision to seek justice through whistleblower channels had been absolutely correct. The Henderson Industries stock chart on my computer screen told the story of corporate destruction in vivid detail, showing how the revelation of massive fraud had transformed a stable, profitable company into a financial disaster that wiped out decades of shareholder value in a matter of days. Before the FBI investigation became public, Henderson Industries had been trading at $47 per share, giving the company a market capitalization of approximately $890 million. The stock had been steadily appreciating over the past several years, reflecting the financial performance improvements I'd implemented as CFO and the market's confidence in the company's management and growth prospects. The first day of public revelation about the federal investigation had been catastrophic for shareholders. Henderson Industries opened trading at $47 and closed at $23, a 51% decline that reflected investor panic about the scope of the alleged fraud and uncertainty about the company's financial stability. Trading volume exceeded normal levels by more than 800%, indicating that institutional investors were desperately trying to liquidate their positions before additional bad news emerged. The second day had been even worse, as details about the $127 million fraud scheme became public through federal court filings and media reports. The stock price collapsed to $11 per share. Investors realized that the company's financial statements for the past 5 years had been artificially inflated by systematic theft, meaning that reported profits, asset values, and growth metrics were fundamentally unreliable. By the end of the first week, Henderson Industries was trading at $6 per share, having lost 87% of its value since the investigation became public. The company's market capitalization had fallen from $890 million to approximately $113 million, representing nearly $800 million in destroyed shareholder wealth. The stock chart showed more than just financial losses. It documented the human cost of the Henderson family's criminal enterprise. Pension funds that had invested in Henderson Industries as a stable, dividend-paying stock had lost hundreds of millions of dollars that would have funded retirement benefits for teachers, firefighters, and other public employees. Individual investors who had trusted the company's financial statements and management integrity had seen their savings destroyed by criminal fraud. Most heartbreaking was the impact on Henderson Industries employees who had invested their retirement savings in company stock through the 401k plan. Many longtime employees had accumulated substantial holdings in Henderson Industries shares, believing that their dedication and hard work were building value in a company they could trust. The stock collapse had destroyed retirement plans and financial security for hundreds of people who had done nothing wrong except trust their employer. The trading volume patterns on the chart revealed the sophisticated investors' desperate attempts to minimize their losses once the fraud became apparent. Mutual funds, pension funds, and institutional investors had dumped millions of shares in the first few days, driving down the price and making it impossible for smaller investors to exit their positions without devastating losses. But the stock chart also told the story of market justice in action. The dramatic price decline reflected investors' accurate assessment that Henderson Industries under Henderson family control was worthless as an investment vehicle. The market had effectively imposed immediate financial consequences for corporate fraud even before the federal criminal justice system could complete its prosecution process. The chart's technical indicators showed classic patterns of corporate collapse following fraud revelation. Volume spikes, support level breakdowns, and momentum indicators all pointed to continued decline, until the company could demonstrate that the criminal enterprise had been completely eliminated and that new management could restore investor confidence. Industry. Analysts had begun issuing research reports that painted an even bleaker picture for Henderson Industries' future prospects. With $127 million stolen from company assets, potential legal liabilities from shareholder lawsuits, and the complete destruction of management credibility, several analysts had issued strong sell recommendations with target prices below $3 per share. The comparison to other corporate fraud cases was sobering. Companies like Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco had never recovered from similar fraud revelations, ultimately declaring bankruptcy or being acquired for pennies on the dollar by competitors. The pattern suggested that Henderson Industries might not survive as an independent company, regardless of the eventual criminal prosecution outcomes, but the stock chart also represented vindication for my decision to expose the Henderson family's crimes. Every dollar of decline in Henderson Industries' stock price was a dollar of wealth that David Henderson could no longer claim as the fruit of his business acumen. The market had effectively stripped away the illusion of legitimate success that had allowed the Henderson family to justify their luxury lifestyle and social status. The regulatory filings that accompanied the stock collapse revealed additional problems that compounded the fraud-related destruction. Henderson Industries was facing potential delisting from major stock exchanges, suspension of banking relationships, and termination of customer contracts as business partners distanced themselves from a company associated with criminal activity. Most significantly, the stock chart documented the immediate effectiveness of federal securities enforcement. The SEC and FBI investigation had achieved in 1 week what years of internal audit procedures and corporate governance reforms might never have accomplished: complete exposure of criminal fraud and immediate market consequences for corporate misconduct. As I watched Henderson Industries' stock price continue its relentless decline, I felt a sense of satisfaction that justice was being served even before criminal trials began. The market had delivered swift, decisive punishment for the Henderson family's crimes, destroying the wealth and status they'd built through systematic theft, and demonstrating that corporate fraud ultimately carries devastating consequences that extend far beyond individual criminal penalties. The federal indictment documents arrived like thunder after lightning, formally charging David Henderson and his family members with crimes that would send them to federal prison for decades and strip away every asset they'd purchased with stolen money. The comprehensive criminal charges, filed in federal district court 6 weeks after the FBI search warrant execution, represented complete validation of everything I'd documented in my whistleblower complaint. United States versus David Henderson. Margaret Henderson, Robert Henderson, and Tyler Henderson was a 47-count indictment that read like a prosecutor's masterpiece. The federal grand jury had found probable cause for charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, securities violations, tax evasion, and operating a criminal enterprise under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The RICO charges were particularly devastating because they allowed federal prosecutors to treat the Henderson family as an organized crime family rather than individual defendants who had committed separate crimes. Under RICO statutes, the government could seek enhanced penalties, comprehensive asset forfeiture, and criminal liability for every member of the family enterprise regardless of their specific roles in individual criminal acts. David Henderson faced the most serious charges as the leader of the criminal enterprise. The indictment accused him of 23 separate felonies, including wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, and conspiracy charges that carried potential sentences totaling more than 200 years in federal prison. The prosecutors had also filed notice of their intent to seek maximum penalties under federal sentencing guidelines, meaning David would likely receive a life sentence if convicted on all charges. Margaret Henderson was charged with 15 felonies related to her participation in the money laundering scheme through her fake consulting company. Federal prosecutors had documented how she'd received $8.4 million in stolen funds while providing no actual services to Henderson Industries. Her charges included conspiracy, money laundering, and tax evasion counts that carried potential sentences exceeding 75 years. Robert Henderson faced 18 felony charges related to his operation of the fake investment management firm that had received $12.7 million in stolen funds. The indictment detailed how Robert had created elaborate documentation for investment services that were never provided while using stolen money to purchase luxury assets, including his Kentucky horse farm. His potential sentence exceeded 90 years if convicted on all charges. Even Tyler Henderson, despite his brief tenure as CFO, was charged with 12 felonies including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. Federal prosecutors had evidence that Tyler had received $2.1 million in stolen funds before his appointment and had attempted to destroy evidence during the FBI search warrant execution. His potential sentence exceeded 60 years, despite his claims of limited involvement in the family criminal enterprise. The indictment also included detailed asset forfeiture provisions that would allow the federal government to seize every asset the Henderson family had purchased with stolen money. The Malibu mansion, Manhattan penthouse, yacht, private jet, luxury vehicles, jewelry, art collections, and investment accounts were all subject to immediate seizure and eventual liquidation to provide restitution for Henderson Industries and its employees. Most satisfying was the specific inclusion of charges related to my termination as CFO. The indictment included obstruction of justice counts that detailed how David Henderson had fired me specifically to prevent discovery and reporting of criminal activities. Federal prosecutors had recognized that my termination was itself a federal crime that enhanced the penalties for the underlying fraud scheme. The indictment narrative read like a comprehensive validation of my whistleblower complaint, incorporating virtually every piece of evidence I'd provided to federal investigators. The detailed transaction analysis, the international money laundering trail, the shell company documentation, and the deleted email chain were all featured prominently in the criminal charges. Federal prosecutors had also included charges for ongoing criminal activity that had continued after my termination. Tyler Henderson's appointment as CFO was characterized as part of a continuing conspiracy to conceal criminal activities and facilitate additional theft from Henderson Industries. The indictment suggested that federal investigators had evidence of continued fraud even after the family believed they'd solved their Sarah problem. The press conference announcing the indictments was led by the U.S. Attorney for our district, who described the case as one of the most sophisticated and damaging corporate fraud schemes ever prosecuted in federal court. The prosecutor specifically praised the courageous whistleblower whose evidence had made the investigation possible, noting that corporate employees who reported criminal activity deserved protection and recognition for their service to justice. The indictment also triggered immediate consequences beyond the criminal charges. Henderson Industries Board of Directors announced the immediate termination of all Henderson family members and the appointment of an interim management team to assess the company's financial condition and determine whether it could survive as an independent entity. Banking relationships were suspended, customer contracts were terminated, and vendor partnerships were canceled, as business partners distanced themselves from a company associated with organized criminal activity. The practical effect was immediate destruction of Henderson Industries as a functioning business, regardless of whether the company could eventually recover from the financial and reputational damage. Most importantly, the federal indictment established my credibility and vindicated my decision to become a whistleblower, rather than remain silent about the criminal activities I'd discovered. Federal prosecutors don't file RICO charges based on employee complaints, unless they have overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal activity. The comprehensive nature of the charges proved that my evidence had been accurate, complete, and essential for exposing the Henderson family's criminal enterprise. As I read through the 47-count indictment that would send the Henderson family to federal prison for decades, I felt a sense of justice and vindication that had been building since the morning David Henderson destroyed my career to protect his criminal activities. The federal indictment wasn't just legal document. It was official recognition that the Henderson family's wealth, status, and business success had been built entirely on systematic theft and criminal fraud that would now face the full consequences of federal justice. The whistleblower reward check that arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday morning was more than just financial compensation. It was official recognition from the federal government that my courage in exposing the Henderson family's criminal enterprise had served the cause of justice and protected countless future victims of corporate fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission had awarded me $25.4 million, representing 20% of the $127 million in fraudulent funds that federal prosecutors had identified and recovered through asset forfeiture proceedings. The award was one of the largest whistleblower payments in SEC history, reflecting both the scope of the criminal enterprise I'd exposed and the quality of evidence I'd provided to federal investigators. The award letter, signed by the SEC's Director of Enforcement, specifically praised my exceptional cooperation and comprehensive documentation that had made the successful prosecution possible. The letter noted that corporate fraud cases of this sophistication typically required years of investigation, but my detailed evidence portfolio had allowed federal prosecutors to file criminal charges within weeks of my initial complaint. More meaningful than the financial amount was the official recognition of my professional integrity and dedication to ethical financial practices. The SEC award represented validation from the nation's premier securities enforcement agency that my decision to risk my career by exposing criminal activity had been not only legally correct but morally essential for protecting investors and employees who had been victimized by systematic fraud. The award also included official commendation for my exceptional professional competence in detecting and documenting sophisticated financial crimes that had evaded detection by external auditors and regulatory oversight for multiple years. Federal investigators had determined that the Henderson family's criminal enterprise might have continued indefinitely without my discovery and reporting of the fraudulent activities. The financial impact of the award was transformative for my personal situation. After 8 years of modest CFO compensation while building Henderson Industries' financial systems, I now possess the resources to pursue any career opportunity without concerns about immediate income needs. The award provided financial independence that would allow me to be selective about future employment and to prioritize ethical considerations over purely financial compensation. But beyond personal financial benefits, the Whistleblower Award represented recognition of the broader principle that corporate employees have both the right and responsibility to report criminal activities when they discover them through legitimate professional duties. My case would encourage other financial professionals to prioritize ethical obligations over corporate loyalty when faced with evidence of systematic fraud. The SEC award ceremony, held at Federal Courthouse in downtown, attracted significant media attention and provided an opportunity for federal prosecutors to highlight the importance of whistleblower cooperation in combating corporate crime. The U.S. Attorney used the ceremony to announce that the Henderson family had agreed to comprehensive plea agreements that would result in lengthy federal prison sentences and complete asset forfeiture. David Henderson had accepted a plea agreement, requiring him to serve 18 years in federal prison and forfeit all assets purchased with stolen funds. Margaret Henderson would serve 12 years. Robert Henderson would serve 14 years. Even Tyler Henderson, despite his claims of limited involvement, would serve 8 years in federal prison for his participation in the criminal enterprise and obstruction of justice. The plea agreements also included provisions requiring the Henderson family to cooperate with ongoing investigations into potential criminal activity at other companies where they had business relationships. Federal prosecutors suspected that the sophisticated money laundering techniques used at Henderson Industries might have been employed in other contexts, and the family's cooperation could lead to additional fraud investigations and prosecutions. Most satisfying was the complete asset forfeiture that stripped away every luxury purchase the Henderson family had made with stolen money. The Malibu mansion, Manhattan penthouse, yacht, private jet, luxury vehicles, jewelry collections, and investment accounts were all liquidated to provide restitution for Henderson Industries and compensation for employees whose retirement savings had been destroyed by the fraud. The federal government had also imposed lifetime bans preventing any Henderson family member from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. David, Margaret, Robert, and Tyler Henderson would never again be in positions where they could exploit investor trust or employee loyalty for criminal purposes. The Whistleblower Award ceremony concluded with my brief remarks about the importance of ethical financial practices and the responsibility of corporate professionals to protect investors and employees from criminal fraud. I emphasized that discovering and reporting criminal activity wasn't a betrayal of corporate loyalty. It was a demonstration of loyalty to the principles of honest business and ethical leadership. The media coverage of the award ceremony and Henderson family plea agreement sent a powerful message to other corporate executives who might be tempted to engage in similar criminal activities. The case demonstrated that sophisticated fraud schemes would ultimately be discovered and that the consequences would include not only lengthy prison sentences, but complete destruction of personal wealth and professional reputation. As I held the $25.4 million whistleblower award check, I reflected on the journey from discovering suspicious transactions in quarterly reports to receiving official recognition as a federal whistleblower who had exposed one of the most significant corporate fraud schemes in regional history. The Henderson family's criminal enterprise had cost me my career at Henderson Industries, but it had also led to financial independence and professional vindication that far exceeded anything I could have achieved through traditional corporate advancement. The Whistleblower Award wasn't just compensation for damages I'd suffered. It was recognition that choosing truth over comfort, justice over security, and ethical principles over personal convenience had been the right decision that ultimately served the broader interests of justice and corporate accountability. The job offer letter from Morrison Financial Group arrived 6 months after the Henderson family plea agreements, representing not just a career opportunity, but validation that my decision to expose corporate fraud had enhanced, rather than damaged, my professional reputation in the financial industry. Morrison Financial Group was one of the most prestigious financial consulting firms in the country, specializing in corporate fraud prevention, forensic accounting, and regulatory compliance for Fortune 500 companies. The position they offered, Senior Director of Financial Integrity, had been created specifically to recruit someone with my unique combination of CFO experience and proven expertise in detecting sophisticated fraud schemes. The offer letter, signed by Morrison's founding partner, explicitly referenced my role in exposing the Henderson Industries fraud as evidence of the exceptional professional competence and ethical courage that made me an ideal candidate for their expanded fraud prevention practice. Rather than viewing my whistleblower status as a liability, Morrison saw it as proof of exactly the kind of integrity and analytical skills they wanted to offer their clients. The financial terms of the offer were extraordinary. Morrison was proposing a starting salary of $485,000, more than double what I'd earned as CFO at Henderson Industries, plus equity participation in the firm, and performance bonuses that could exceed my base salary in years when our fraud prevention practice achieved its revenue targets. The compensation package reflected the market value of proven expertise in corporate fraud detection and prevention, but more meaningful than the financial terms was the scope of professional responsibility Morrison was offering. As Senior Director of Financial Integrity, I would lead a team of forensic accountants and fraud investigators serving clients across multiple industries. My role would involve developing fraud prevention systems, conducting complex financial investigations, and providing expert testimony in corporate fraud cases. The position would also involve significant public speaking and industry education responsibilities. Morrison wanted me to represent the firm at conferences, regulatory hearings, and professional development programs where my experience as a successful whistleblower could educate other financial professionals about their ethical obligations and legal protections when discovering criminal activity. Within weeks of accepting Morrison's offer, I received additional opportunities that demonstrated how my whistleblower experience had transformed my career prospects. 3 major corporations offered consulting contracts for comprehensive fraud prevention assessments. 2 business schools invited me to teach graduate courses in corporate ethics and financial fraud detection. A major publisher proposed a book contract for my account of exposing the Henderson Industries fraud. The consulting opportunities were particularly satisfying because they represented demand for exactly the kind of ethical financial leadership that the Henderson family had tried to destroy when they terminated my employment. Companies wanted my expertise precisely because I'd demonstrated the courage to prioritize legal and ethical obligations over corporate loyalty and personal security. The corporate clients included several companies in Henderson Industries' industry sector, firms that wanted independent assessment of their financial controls and fraud prevention systems to ensure they weren't vulnerable to the kind of systematic theft that had destroyed Henderson Industries. My role involved reviewing financial procedures, testing internal controls, and training executive teams to recognize and respond to potential fraud indicators. The teaching opportunities at business schools allowed me to influence the next generation of financial professionals who would face similar ethical challenges in their careers. My graduate courses in corporate ethics covered not only the technical aspects of fraud detection, but also the moral and legal frameworks that should guide financial professionals when discovering evidence of criminal activity. The book project provided an opportunity to document the complete story of exposing the Henderson family's criminal enterprise, from discovering the first suspicious transactions through the federal prosecution and asset forfeiture that had brought justice to their victims. The publisher believed my account would serve as both a cautionary tale about corporate corruption and an inspiring example of ethical courage in professional life. Most importantly, these new opportunities represented recognition that my experience as a whistleblower had made me more valuable to the financial industry, rather than less. Companies, educational institutions, and professional organizations wanted to associate with someone who had demonstrated that ethical principles could prevail over criminal corruption when supported by competent financial analysis and personal courage. The transformation in my career prospects also reflected broader changes in corporate culture and regulatory environment following high-profile fraud cases like Henderson Industries. Companies were increasingly prioritizing compliance and ethical leadership as essential business functions rather than bureaucratic obstacles, creating demand for professionals with proven expertise in maintaining financial integrity. Federal regulatory agencies had also enhanced their focus on fraud prevention and early detection, creating new requirements for internal controls and whistleblower protection programs that companies needed expert guidance to implement effectively. My combination of technical expertise and practical experience with fraud detection and reporting made me ideally qualified to help companies navigate these enhanced regulatory requirements. As I reviewed the multiple career opportunities that had emerged from my decision to expose the Henderson family's crimes, I realized that David Henderson's attempt to destroy my professional life by terminating my employment had actually launched me into a more successful and meaningful career than anything I could have achieved by remaining silent about criminal activity. The job offer from Morrison Financial Group wasn't just employment. It was recognition that choosing truth over convenience, justice over security, and ethical principles over personal comfort had been not only morally correct, but professionally advantageous in an industry that increasingly valued integrity and competence over corporate loyalty and political convenience. The new business card in my wallet bore the title Sarah Mitchell, Senior Director of Financial Integrity, Morrison Financial Group, but it represented much more than just another job title. It symbolized my transformation from a corporate employee who had discovered criminal activity to an independent professional whose expertise in fraud detection and ethical leadership was sought by companies across multiple industries. 2 years after David Henderson fired me to protect his criminal enterprise, I was sitting in my corner office at Morrison Financial Group, reviewing fraud prevention assessments for 3 Fortune 500 companies, while preparing testimony for a congressional hearing on corporate whistleblower protections. The journey from discovering suspicious transactions at Henderson Industries to becoming a nationally recognized expert in corporate fraud prevention had been remarkable, but it had also taught me lessons about courage, integrity, and the ultimate consequences of choosing truth over comfort. The most important lesson was that corporate loyalty should never override ethical and legal obligations. David Henderson had counted on my loyalty to the company and my personal affection for him to prevent me from investigating and reporting the criminal activities I'd discovered. He'd assumed that my concern for my career and financial security would outweigh my professional responsibility to protect Henderson Industries and its employees from systematic theft. But true loyalty to a company means protecting it from criminal activity, even when that criminal activity is being perpetuated by senior executives. My decision to expose the Henderson family's fraud scheme had ultimately served the legitimate interests of Henderson Industries, its employees, and its shareholders, even though it had destroyed the careers and freedom of the executives who had been stealing from the company. The second lesson was that speaking truth to power requires both moral courage and professional competence. Ethical intentions alone wouldn't have been sufficient to expose the Henderson family's sophisticated criminal enterprise. My ability to detect, investigate, and document complex financial fraud had been essential for building the case that led to federal prosecution and asset recovery. Financial professionals have unique responsibilities and capabilities when it comes to preventing and detecting corporate crime. Our technical expertise, access to financial records, and understanding of business operations put us in positions where we're likely to discover criminal activity before anyone else. With that privilege comes the obligation to prioritize legal and ethical requirements over personal convenience or corporate politics. The third lesson was that federal whistleblower protections and rewards create powerful incentives for corporate employees to report criminal activity rather than remain silent out of fear for their careers. The $25.4 million SEC award I'd received for exposing the Henderson Industries fraud had not only provided financial independence, but had also sent a message to other financial professionals that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. My experience had also demonstrated that choosing ethical courage over corporate loyalty ultimately enhanced rather than damaged career prospects in the financial industry. Companies increasingly wanted to hire professionals who had demonstrated integrity under pressure, understanding that ethical leadership was essential for protecting corporate reputation and avoiding regulatory problems. The consulting work I now performed for Morrison Financial Group involved helping companies build fraud prevention systems and ethical cultures that would prevent the kind of systematic criminal activity that had destroyed Henderson Industries. My role included training executive teams to recognize fraud indicators, developing internal controls that would detect suspicious transactions, and implementing whistleblower protection programs that encouraged employees to report potential problems before they became major criminal enterprises. The most satisfying aspect of my new career was the opportunity to protect other companies and their employees from experiencing the kind of betrayal and financial harm that the Henderson family had inflicted on Henderson Industries. Every fraud prevention system I designed, every executive team I trained, and every internal control I implemented represented potential protection for thousands of employees whose financial security depended on their employer's ethical leadership. My work also contributed to broader efforts to restore public confidence in corporate leadership and financial markets. High-profile fraud cases like Henderson Industries had damaged investor trust and employee confidence in corporate America, but successful whistleblower cases demonstrated that criminal activity would ultimately be discovered and punished, while ethical behavior would be protected and rewarded. The congressional testimony I'd provided on corporate whistleblower protections had contributed to legislative efforts to strengthen federal enforcement capabilities and enhance rewards for employees who reported criminal activity. My case had become a model for how comprehensive documentation and federal cooperation could expose sophisticated fraud schemes while protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. As I looked at my business card and reflected on the transformation from CFO Sarah Mitchell to financial integrity expert Sarah Mitchell, I realized that David Henderson had unknowingly done me the greatest favor of my professional life when he fired me to protect his criminal enterprise. His attempt to silence me had launched me into a more meaningful and successful career than anything I could have achieved by remaining a corporate employee at Henderson Industries. The Henderson family was now serving lengthy federal prison sentences, while I was building a career dedicated to preventing other executives from making the same criminal choices that had destroyed their lives and freedom. Their attempt to destroy my professional life for discovering their crimes had ultimately demonstrated that truth, courage, and ethical principles would always prevail over corruption, criminality, and abuse of corporate power. My new business card wasn't just professional identification. It was proof that choosing justice over comfort, integrity over security, and ethical courage over corporate loyalty had been the decision that defined not only my career, but my character and my contribution to ensuring that corporate America served the interests of employees, investors, and society, rather than the criminal ambitions of corrupt executives.